So you've already started your climate change over Earth's history explain 1, and you've been reading and highlighting ideas related to climate change, right? So impacting climate. So we're thinking about temperature change. So we have 3 things focusing on. Our first one here is changes in greenhouse gases. So you've read through, you answered some questions coming right from the reading, okay? And so now here's where we're at. We're thinking about how these greenhouse gases cause this idea of greenhouse effect. So our major greenhouse gases are, of course, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane. And together, they make this greenhouse effect on the Earth. So what we want to do is diagram this out and then put a few notes in to kind of solidify our thinking about what this greenhouse effect is. So to make our diagram, we're going to start here with, of course, the Earth. And then we want to put in our atmosphere. So typically when we hear greenhouse effects, maybe what comes to mind is an actual greenhouse, right? A glass structure that lets light in. Well, the atmosphere is just like that. So if we add a sun to our diagram, we should then be able to draw in some solar radiation coming down to the Earth's surface, just like we've seen with albedo, right? The sun's energy hits everywhere on the Earth's surface, and depending on that surface, some of the energy will reflect out, right? Everything has a different albedo. But what we're talking about here is now, how does the atmosphere deal with that reflected energy? One of the main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide or CO2, is found all throughout the atmosphere. Okay? What CO2 does is when solar radiation is reflected from the Earth's surface, that CO2 grabs the energy and keeps it in, right? So one of the things we want to think about over here in our greenhouse effect notes is CO2 absorbs absorbs reflected solar radiation, which keeps heat in. And it's keeping it in the atmosphere. Just like we saw on Earth, when things absorb heat, they warm up. So we're seeing that same thing here with the atmosphere. The particles in the atmosphere are heating up the atmosphere as they absorb more solar radiation. Now, a lot of times when we hear this idea, we think about negative thoughts, right? We think, oh, more CO2, that's not good. But in reality, like you read up here, the greenhouse effect is actually a good thing, okay? The greenhouse effect is the process of these gases kind of acting like a blanket and keeping the Earth's temperature regulated. If we don't have these little CO2s, that solar energy is now going back to the atmosphere, and or out of the atmosphere, back into space, and it's gone. So we need some CO2 in the air to act like that blanket, keeping heat in. But the problem comes when we start to get more CO2, right? The more CO2 that appears in the atmosphere, the more that is absorbed, the more heat is kept in. So that's what we have to keep in mind. If we're getting too much CO2 over time, then we're seeing an impact negative from the greenhouse effect. So we want to add one more statement here. More CO2 in the atmosphere means more energy absorbed, and like we said, The more energy that gets absorbed, the warmer the atmosphere becomes. So in general, greenhouse effect, we like that, okay? Some planets don't have the greenhouse effect, and their climate, of course, is unlivable, right? Without an atmosphere, that heat can't stay in. So CO2 really does a great job regulating our temperature, allowing us to live. But if that imbalance with CO2 becomes too great, too much energy is going to be absorbed, and we're going to see that temperature increase. Just like in the reverse, if we lose a lot of CO2, that temperature would decrease. So the greenhouse effect temperature of the atmosphere is directly related to how much or how little CO2 there is in the air. You should be able now to answer these couple questions from our reading and our discussion, and you're keeping going on to volcanic eruptions. Check out this video if you need help with the graph and volcano questions.